good people. It's Professor Wachtel. The topic of this discussion is an introduction to Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. If you ask people to name some philosophers, it's pretty common that these three names are among the first to appear, and perhaps the only to appear. So they are well known, they are famous. Their ideas take a good deal of discussion to really get into. What I'd like to focus on in this short introductory discussion is a very small amount of biographical detail to help explain their relationships to one another, perhaps to mention some main characteristics of their thought, and to perhaps show the way in which their relationship shaped some early philosophical dialogue. The story of Socrates is famous. He seems to have been pushed toward philosophical inquiry by a friend of his who one day asked the oracle at Delphi, which was an ancient Greek religious authority, who is the wisest person in Athens? Socrates' friend asked the oracle, who is the wisest person in Athens? And the oracle replied, Socrates. No one was more surprised by this than Socrates himself. His friend came to him one day and said, guess what, Socrates? The oracle says you are the wisest guy, wisest person in Athens. I can imagine Socrates saying, who? Me? No way. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go find somebody wiser than me. It should not be hard. After all, I don't claim to be an expert on anything. I don't claim to have any great knowledge. So I'm going to go look among the people who claim to have some great knowledge, and I'm going to find one who does. Oh, and I'll be back in about an hour. So who did Socrates go to? His first stop was with the politicians. Not surprising, right? Politicians are forever telling people how they should live, what's right and what's wrong, what the laws should be. You would think that people who are speaking in that way would have some kind of knowledge upon which to base their statements. Socrates was a little bit disappointed, however, when he spoke with them. He was disappointed with the outcome of the conversations. Whatever the politicians may have said to him, he thought of questions for which they did not have answers, and pretty frequently he found holes in their reasoning. He found holes in the support that they gave to their views. Well, what effect did this have on the politicians? In general, it made them mad at Socrates. They did not like this non-politician coming to them and asking them hard questions about their views. Socrates thought, well, okay, I guess the politicians don't have anybody wiser among them. What do I know about myself? What, if anything, can I say of myself? Unlike them, if I don't know something, I don't act as if I know it. I don't put forward arguments that are full of holes. I just say, I don't know, and ask some more questions. If I have any wisdom, Socrates thought, it's that when I don't know something, I know I don't know it. Socrates' next step was to visit the playwrights. Playwrights in ancient Greece were important people. Theater was the dominant form of cultural expression of the time, and in fact, the works of many ancient Greek playwrights are performed today. The same problem, however, occurred between Socrates and the playwrights as occurred among Socrates and the politicians. The playwrights thought they had profound truths to express. They thought they had some great knowledge. Upon close questioning, it seems they also had some holes in their views. They were vulnerable to good questions. Not to be dissuaded, Socrates made a third stop. His third stop was with the artisans. The artisans in ancient Greece were the people who knew how to make things. I like to think of the artisans of ancient Greece as analogous to the technologists of today. Do the technologists of today have ideas about what's real and how we should live? I don't think it's difficult to conclude that they do. People who are good at manipulating physical reality, good at creating goods and services, very often have ideas about what the world is like and what society should be like. Unfortunately, the same thing occurred with the artisans. Their views, Socrates found, were vulnerable to close questioning, and like the playwrights and like the politicians, they did not like having this pointed out to them. So what was the outcome of Socrates' attempt to find someone wiser than him? The outcome was that he made many enemies. A lot of people were mad at Socrates. Socrates walked away from the experience thinking, again, as I said a moment ago, well, if I have any wisdom at all, my wisdom is that when I don't know something, I do not pretend to know it. I don't make grander claims than that for which I have any reason. And you know what? That is something. An effect of Socrates having angered the politicians, the playwrights, and the artisans, that is some very, very powerful people in ancient Athens, was that he found himself charged with some terrible crimes. He was charged with corrupting the youth, and he was charged with disbelieving in the gods of the city. For these crimes, he found himself on trial, facing a death penalty. In fact, in spite of having offered a credible defense of his activities, and a credible defense that showed that he was in no way intentionally corrupting the youth, and perhaps not corrupting them at all, and a credible defense that showed that he believed in spiritual beings, he was convicted of corrupting the youth and convicted of disbelieving in the gods of the city, and he was sentenced to death. Why were the politicians, the playwrights, and the artisans so angry at Socrates? Well, one of the consequences of Socrates showing that powerful people knew less than they claimed to know was that he developed an audience of people who appreciated his questioning, and this audience tended to be some of the younger people in Athens. So the powerful seemed to worry that Socrates was undermining their power as he demonstrated to listeners that they did not know all the things they claimed to be very, very sure of. Among these younger listeners was a young man named Plato. Plato's writing is one of the sources of our knowledge of Socrates. There are others. There are other historical works in which Socrates' life and activities are discussed. But Plato wrote most voluminously of Socrates. Now, Plato, in his earliest writings, sought to show Socrates the way the man really was. He wrote dialogues that expressed the types of conversations that Socrates had with various figures in Athens, and in those dialogues he also sought to show the method of questioning that Socrates applied to the claims of people like the politicians, the playwrights, and the artisans of his time. It is in a series of dialogues by Plato. First, the Apology, second, the Crito, and third, the Phaedo, that Plato tells the story of Socrates' defense in court. This is the subject of the Apology, of Socrates' principled refusal not to be broken out of jail and not to flee from Athens. That's the subject of the Crito. And finally, Plato tells the story of Socrates' last day in the dialogue called the Phaedo. Eventually, in Plato's career, he came to think he had some answers to big philosophical questions. In the middle period of Plato's career, he wrote dialogues that continued to use Socrates as a central figure. But the Socrates that we meet in Plato's middle dialogues is actually a mouthpiece for Plato's ideas. So it's common to refer to the Socrates of Plato's middle dialogues as Plato's character, Socrates, or in some cases, when the words are attributed to Socrates in the dialogue, many people will say, well, Plato thinks, that is, eliding Plato with his character of Socrates. One feature of the historical Socrates that is frequently maintained, even in Plato's middle dialogues, is Socrates' method of questioning. Another feature of Socrates that is often maintained in Plato's middle dialogues is Socrates' shall we say, mystical bent. Socrates was an unusual figure in ancient Athens. He was an aristocrat, that is, he was born of the aristocratic class, but there's no indication that he cared about money or power. He deeply, deeply loved Athens and had been a soldier in the Athenian army and was said to have fought valiantly for Athens. At times, many people noticed Socrates basically doing the equivalent of staring into space. He claimed to have reveries that motivated him to think beyond the world of ordinary sensory experience. He also claimed to be guided by a spirit that he called his daimon, that pushed him to value truth and the state of a person's soul above worldly goods. These features of the historical Socrates found their way into Plato's character, Socrates. At this point, we won't be discussing Plato's philosophical ideas. Wrote voluminously, unlike Socrates, who did not write at all. Socrates believed all philosophical interaction should be done in face-to-face dialogue. Thus did not write at all. Plato respected Socrates' view, but Plato took Socratic dialogue and actually wrote it down and founded a school called the Academy for the purpose of the teaching and development of his philosophical ideas. At some point, a young student showed up in Plato's Academy, and Plato quickly realized that this young man was a very unusual student, extremely capable, swift of mind, an independent thinker, This young student's name was Aristotle. Aristotle spent a significant chunk of his life in Plato's Academy, first as a student and then as a teacher. Even so, even though Aristotle was in residence in Plato's Academy for a very long time, Aristotle was not a Platonist. Aristotle quickly engaged with his teacher, but did not just repeat the teachings of Plato. Aristotle asked questions of Plato. Aristotle offered counter-arguments to ideas of Plato's. He was his own man. Aristotle was so much Plato's favorite student that Plato, it is said, would not start classes without Aristotle. It is also said that Plato nicknamed Aristotle Nous, N-O-U-S, which is the ancient Greek word for mind. After Plato died, Aristotle had the thought that leadership of the academy should pass to him. Whomever was in charge of making such decisions, however, passed leadership to one of Plato's nephews, who was more of an orthodox Platonist, that is, a person who understood Plato's philosophy but really did not challenge it in the way that Aristotle was motivated to. Aristotle at this time decided that life in the academy was no longer for him, and he went back to the land in which he was born, which was Macedonia, and he took a job as a tutor to a young royal prince by the name of Alexander, who eventually grew up to be Alexander the Great. So Aristotle was Alexander the Great's, the young Alexander the Great, or the Alexander before he was all that great. He was the young Alexander's personal tutor. Eventually, Alexander grew up, began his military campaigns. Aristotle, who had been concerned with philosophy, who had been deeply interested in philosophy, all the while developing interests in, among other areas, metaphysics, logic, ethics, politics, art, biology, zoology, astronomy, and one could add a few more to the list, but that's quite a list. Aristotle found his way back to Athens, founded his own school called the Lyceum. At some point, in part due to Alexander's military campaigns, there was a tide in Athens of anti-Macedonian sentiment. At this time, Aristotle decided he would go back to Macedonia. He was afraid for his life. He is said to have said he was going to flee Athens so that Athens did not sin twice against philosophy. It is likely he had in mind the execution of Socrates. Aristotle moved back to Macedonia, and within a year, both he and Alexander were dead. Alexander in his early 30s, Aristotle in his early 60s. Okay, well, that is a short introduction to these three major figures, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. A short introduction that expresses some minimal biographical detail and some sense of the relationships among these figures.